take it away.
Thank you. So good afternoon. My name is Tim Sykes. I'm a part-time mature postgraduate researcher at the University of Southampton. My research is co-funded by the Environment Agency, my employer, and the Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust on behalf of the Testenich and Catchment Partnership. I'm going to describe to you today some of my early analysis, so not results yet, just early ongoing analysis of interviews I've conducted with people walking along the headwaters of chalk streams in south central England. These headwaters are temporary in nature and are called winterbournes. To help with that, I'm going to use two theories from environmental psychology that seek to help us understand our relationship with these winterbournes. That nature can improve our mental fatigue and concentration. This theory posits that there are four qualities of the environment that really help us to attract our attention. Fascination is a particular one. The capacity of the environment to involuntarily capture our attention. Looking at flowing water is a really good example. Another one for me is watching flames in a campfire, where you quickly just descend into some kind of trance-like state. You're not thinking about life, you're looking at the flames in an involuntary way. Another example of this experiential quality is the coherence or the extent of nature. Its complexity and perceived richness are important. The other example is stress recovery theory, which posits that the nature can help restore us from stress. These restorative environments include flowing water, deflected vistas, for example, a meandering watercourse. That kind of hint in the landscape sometimes that there's something just round the corner that's really interesting that you want to explore. And again, complexity comes into this theory. High biodiversity and the perceived complexity in a scene that one is looking at. My research, in this case, I'll be looking through the lens of cultural ecosystem services. Born from the Millennium Assessment, it's undergone a series of developments and an evolution by a number of authors who have produced lists of ways that we think that we benefit from nature. These cultural ecosystem services are intangible and hard to express in monetary terms. The column on the right shows some of my initial analysis. The people I have talked to so far, of which there's been 17, share very strong feelings about some of these cultural ecosystem services. For example, all of the landowners I've talked to have strong bequest values. That is to say that they are keen to pass on their temporary stream to future generations in a condition that's better than it is now. They also all share well-developed stewardship values, closely related, I think, to bequest values, where they're all undertaking practical measures to protect and conserve their temporary streams. But it's evident that society as a whole doesn't share those kind of views, and so we're just going to explore the aesthetic values a bit deeper. We're going to do that with particular regards to fascination and habitat complexity. It's widely acknowledged that in their flowing phases, temporary winterbournes are attractive, and that's largely put down to the water, the presence of water, and I'll come on to that in a moment. But on their dry phase, there are still people who are fascinated by these winterbournes. People I have interviewed have expressed a great deal of attraction towards the dry phase, and I've hypothesized and asked them if they could swap their winterbourne for a perennial chalk stream, would they do so? And all but one have said no. For them, they get the best of both worlds. They have a flowing phase where their Winterbourne shares many of the characteristics of a perennial chalk stream, for example, perceived high biodiversity and the aesthetics of the water itself. But then they get this added bonus of a dry stream, which they associate with having a great character. This appeals to people's intellectual interest and curiosity, which is bordering on fascination. But suffice to say that not everybody feels like that, and some of the people I've talked to describe their dry Winterbourne as actually being quite repulsive. They actively avoid it when it's dry, compared to being attracted to it in its flowing phase. Many of them describe it as being uninteresting and even boring, the opposite of fascination. And some of them describe their dry Winterbourne as being dead. Similarly, it's not clear-cut regarding complexity. So in some cases, even when there's flow available, there's water with all of the interest that brings, if the habitat itself is oversimplified, it might still be perceived as being negative or as not really capturing people's attention in the way that we would look at with regards to the theories I've described above. So let's just look at that a bit closer. The bottom right is the source of the River Itchen in south central England. It's a spring. It's temporary in nature. And the water will have percolated through the chalk geology for decades, which means that when it emerges, it's crystal clear, or as we often say, is gin clear. And that water clarity is widely held amongst the people I've talked to as being one of the primary reasons why the flowing phase is fascinating to them. It allows them to see the bed of the Winterbourne, as well as the prolific macrophyte growth in it. And of course, the clarity of the water is inferred as implying a very high quality, good enough to drink. And the clarity of the water also plays with light, creating opportunities for reflections, which people have described as being important to them, and they highly value that, both day and night. Looking at the fascination a bit further, people have described a scene like this on the left as being fascinating. It's unusual to see a watercourse with such prolific macrophyte growth, and when the ranunculus in this case is in flower, it's very attractive, and it really draws your attention towards it. It also is seen as implying a good water quality and a high biodiversity. People I've interviewed describe a scene like this as being very natural. But take away the macrophyte when the Winterbourne is returning to its natural ponded or even dry phase, and then people describe that as being unnatural, as having a poor biodiversity, and a large part of it may be down to its simplified form. It has it's over-engineered, it's straightened, it's heavily grazed, so there's very little vegetation complexity as well. And clearly many of our Winterbourne headwaters have really failed to capture our imagination in the past. These views are all of the Candover Brook, which is a headwater to the River Itchen. The River Itchen is biologically one of the richest rivers in the UK. It's very highly protected, and it's very highly valued for a multitude of ecosystem services. But clearly, its headwaters have failed to attract our attention. We treat it literally as a roadside ditch, and we manage it as such. So the picture on the bottom left here, you can see it's taking road runoff directly, and on the right, it's an agricultural field drain. In the UK, we often talk about having a catchment-based approach, but these headwaters have clearly failed to attract sufficient importance or value for us to manage them in that way. And there are lots of examples of Winterbournes that have been where ecosystem services have been missed and even precluded through the way they're managed. This is the Bourne rivulet in Hampshire in its flowing, ponded and pooling phase. And clearly the landowner here doesn't manage it to optimise its ecosystem services in the round. That's not the case everywhere. The picture here on the right is a temporary spring and winterbourne in the Sussex Downs. You can see clearly there's a diversity, a range of morphology, topography, there's exposed riverine sediments, there's a range of vegetation, species and structure, and there's a lot of woody debris. This type of scene people have described as being fascinating because it really does capture the imagination. It kind of invites you to walk upstream, to search for the spring, for that vista that's out of sight, that mystery that the landscape can offer. Perhaps less so, the scene on the left is the River Lavant near Chichester. It's undergone a degree of engineering, but it still retains an element of that sinuosity that people describe to me as being natural in form. And scenes like this are assumed to have an ecological function too that is valued by people. But the question still needs to be asked: is the presence of water itself per se, with all of its everything it brings in terms of reflections and implied biodiversity, is that enough for us to really value these landscapes? The landscape character is very denuded of biodiversity and of complexity. So as river managers, we're in a section today called Science and Management, so we're going to try to relate this to how we might improve with the way we value and manage these winterbournes. Clearly helping people to be aware of and to appreciate these winterbournes and the biodiversity in the aquatic phase is important. Perhaps more so is to help people understand their biodiversity and complexity in their dry phase. Perhaps society could come to see these winterbournes as naturally terrestrial environments that are sometimes wet. That way they may understand that the terrestrial invertebrate fauna, it can be rare and interesting, and maybe even described as fascinating.
2 minutes, Tim.
Thank you. And it's the scene on the right here might be described by some as being more complex even than if it had been flowing. How we manage the riverbanks is important. Reducing grazing allows vegetation to evolve in more complex ways, creating scenes that aesthetically might capture our attention. On the left here, the landowners have even planted trees. This is usually done for biodiversity purposes in terms of climate change resilience, for example, cooling the river for brown trout, but might also add complexity to the landscape that would attract our attention. And finally, I would draw a look at how we can design in-stream habitat enhancement better in future. Again, this is the Candover Brook on the left, bottom left. It's very straight, it's over-engineered, very simplified, as you can see. And what we've done here is trying to kickstart hydrological morphology and associated processes and biodiversity. Those are usually the drivers for river enhancement. But might we design these schemes better to benefit people, to capture our attention, and to help foster feelings of bequest and stewardship more? Thank you very much.